That very afternoon, when I was last in this church in October of 2006, we went over to the Stockton Public Library and looked in the directories. You know, this is what preceded phone books. I don't know what's going to come after phone books, right? Everyone has cell phones now and computers. In any case, next slide. Looking in 1919, which was the date I had in the book, we found, in fact, Kacandes, and here he is, James. It lists his occupation as a cook, and sure enough, it has him on San Joaquin. James then made his way over to San Francisco, not too far from here, and he's also listed in the food industry, this time as a waiter. That was from the directory of 1922. And then this story gets very, very sad because the next time we locate James is in the 1930 census, but this particular piece of the census, which is from New Jersey, is from Greystone Hospital. Greystone was a hospital for the insane, and somehow James had ended up there by 1930. Next slide. I just want to skip briefly to the younger brother. They seem to have fought in St. Louis, so to my knowledge, Steve Kacandes never came out here of Stappios, but he also ended up in the Army. And unfortunately, he too ended up in a military hospital where he was receiving treatment for mental troubles, and he passed away in 1965 and was buried in the VA cemetery in New Jersey. Now, the reason I'm giving you these details is it turns out that 4 Kacandes men of the same generation, the generation of some of your grandparents or parents, ended up in New Jersey in around 1930, living just miles from each other. And I don't know how much they knew about the fact that all 4 of them were located. So the 4 are my own grandfather, George, his older brother, Tom, and these 2 men, Stephen and James. And 2 of those men were very, very ill, and they really needed help, and they really could have used family. And to my knowledge, they died alone and probably very sad. And it tore my heartstrings to think that someone who was related to me, first cousins, as you know, in Greek culture and many other cultures are considered very, very close relatives, that they ended up there not knowing that they had families. I was alive at that time, before Stephen anyway had died, and he could have at least been embraced by a family, but no one knew he was there. So I have to skip over a lot of pieces in my story, but I want to tell you some about how I connect this up. Because of the existence of these 2 books with James Kacandes' signature, it's clear to me that my own grandfather must have known something about the whereabouts of his cousins. He probably didn't know that much, but more importantly, on some level, he didn't want to know that much. One of the hard lessons I learned through this book, in addition to all the lessons I learned about war, is that immigration, too, is a kind of war for survival. And in America, we love to praise the stories of the winning side of immigration. We integrated, we had children, we got good jobs, we educated our children, we have offspring, and we forget about that hidden side of immigration, those people who didn't really succeed. Only it's not completely forgotten, right? Somewhere there's that fear of failure, that profound fear that maybe we won't make it. And I think my own grandfather felt an enormous pressure to succeed. And he passed on that pressure to my father. And my father, for sure, passed it on to his 6 children. And I think that journey of assimilation needs to be looked at. We need to collect those stories, not just the good ones, but also some of the sad ones. So I've told you a lot of different things. One of the reasons I came here was to say thank you. Thank you to Gail. Thank you to Father. Thank you to the people who embraced me when I showed up with my cousin completely unannounced, and we were looking for information about the early Stockton. But I also wanted to urge you, wherever you're from, to collect your family stories. When people die, those stories disappear with them. And I'm sure you can all think of someone you loved very much who's no longer with us on this side, and the stories you wish you had paid a little more attention to. So one of the reasons I wrote this book was to work through my own stories, to understand them better. But another reason was to encourage people to work through their family stories. And the first step is just to collect them. If we don't collect them, we'll never have access to them in the future. So even if you don't think of yourself as a writer or an intellectual or even necessarily as a good listener, most of us can get a hold of a tape recorder and just turn that on and ask someone you love, so how did you get here? You know, who were the people you knew when you first came? Why did you go to Stockton and not to some other place? And even if you don't have the strength or the desire to put those stories into a form, at least they're somewhere and they can be passed on. So I want to try to connect this message of mine by reading you the dedication of this book, because I thought about it long and hard, and what I came up with is this. I dedicate this book to children of all times and places trapped in somebody's war. So I use that also now to summarize what I'd like to share with you about this book. My father, through no choice of his own, got trapped in Greece and went through the Second World War, the Greek occupation, and stages of the Greek Civil War, and suffered very, very badly. He suffered in a way that made it hard for him not to pass on that suffering to his own children. I don't think he did that intentionally, but it's happened. And we have wars in many, many places for many, many reasons, most of which are not very logical when you take a look at them. And worst of all, people get trapped in those situations who had nothing to do with the decisions to wage the wars. Similarly, though, those wars often push people to other places, right? We have refugees all over the world from war situations, and they take the good and the bad of their home culture with them, and so they themselves are waging some kind of war with their past, with the area they had to flee from, with family they had to separate from. And so this is some kind of large plea from my heart to you to think about that and think about what we might need to do. Father, I appreciated so much today in your sermon how you said we have to start today, and the way is with love, right? So thinking about love and how we can use that to embrace people who have suffered, people who might be alone, people who might be suffering here or physically, and find out, how come they're suffering so bad? Because if I try not to live my life full of regrets, I do regret not learning this sooner, not knowing what my family had been through. So I think I'm going to stop trying your patience by ending it here, but I've opened up many, many cans without closing too many, so I'm very happy to answer your questions. And also for any of you who have ancestors who came to Stockton in the early 20th century, I would be thrilled if you would share with us a little bit about what you know about when they came and why they came here. Thank you very, very much, and it's really a pleasure to have been connected with this community unexpectedly.